Our next presenter, and actually the last formal presentation, is Ron Whitener. JD is a member of the Squaxin Island Tribe of Washington. He is an affiliated assistant professor at the University of Washington School of Law and associate judge for the Untitled Tribe and president of the newly formed Center of Indigenous Research and Justice. He has worked as a tribal attorney for the Squaxin Island Tribe. His research interests focus on the intersection of law and health issues for Native Americans. In 2011, Judge Whitener received the White House designation as a champion of change for using law to close the justice gap in America. Please welcome Ron Whitener.
Thank you. I don't know if you should trust me around this. From beginning. All right. So, as my bio noted, I'm a little bit of a square peg in a round hole here. I'm an attorney, and as an attorney, I know just enough to be dangerous with this stuff. I was sort of drug into genomics a little bit at the University of Washington because they had funding for training of an American Indian junior faculty member to work in a newly formed Center of Genomics and Healthcare Equality. And so I was talked into coming in and being trained in that. Now, once I started working in it, I'd worked in the area of health for some time, but usually, up to that point, it had been first as attorney for my tribe, working with the tribe on setting up its healthcare system, working with its, setting up our clinic, working with the Indian Health Service and transferring jurisdiction from the Indian Health Service to the tribe under a self-governance compact. And then after that, I went into legal services where I represented individual Native Americans in state, tribal, and federal courts, usually helping them out of, or at least with a bad situation. Either they were charged with a crime, or perhaps they were parents whose children had been removed from them for neglect or abuse, or they were being evicted from low-income housing. And one of the things that I noticed in working with them is that there were always health issues that they brought with them. Usually things like substance abuse, other chronic conditions, some of which led to substance abuse. And I saw this intersection between the law and health that I hadn't seen as much, although looking back, I'd certainly seen it in my family at Squaxin Island. And so in that training, I started working with mentors like Dr. Henderson and Dr. Manson from University of Colorado and other folks who helped me as much as they could to enter in this area of working with research. And really where I've carved out the little area that I do work in is working with tribes and tribal organizations who want to partner in research with universities usually, and also working with universities themselves, mostly with the University of Washington, to try to deal with the legal issues that come with working with tribes. Because unlike other populations, when you're working with a tribe, you're working with a sovereign entity. They're recognized by the United States as being sovereign, and that sovereignty didn't come from the United States recognizing them. It came from being a sovereign nation for thousands of years, perhaps tens of thousands of years, as we learn today. And that sovereignty still exists, and the tribes are able to exert it over researchers and over members who are being asked to participate in research. And so it's in this area that I tend to work. One of the things that I do though is, and I'm going to flash through some slides really fast, because one of the things that we are working on right now is trying to set up and look at what are the contours of a research regulatory system at my tribe. It's a small tribe, approximately 1,200 members now, The health clinic is tribally controlled, which is really important if anybody does research in Indian country. It's often very difficult to do research when the tribal health clinic is still run by the Indian Health Service, whereas Squaxin's health clinic is run by the tribe as an agency of the tribe. I got to go back. And then Abigail had her comment about always putting relatives. So that's my great-grandmother and my grandfather, and the story of the family is that picture actually hangs somewhere in the Smithsonian, and according to my grandmother is entitled Indian Madonna. I have never found it. I don't know if it's true, and I'm kind of scared to look and find out that it's not, because it's a great story. That's Squaxin Island, very proud of it. It's our little reservation, completely uninhabited and natural. And so we were funded by the National Human Genome Research Institute to do this work. And we're right now finalizing the papers for it. But one of the things we wanted to do, and I'm going to touch on some things that Abigail already discussed from the surveys that we did at Squaxin, we pushed into the survey that we did on biospecimens. But I have some graphs, so I've got to put up my graphs. So one of the things I really want to do is know what individual members think before we go and make policy changes at a tribal level to review and regulate research. And so we went and asked tribal members, all of whom were members of the Squaxin Island Tribe, and all over the age of 18. And we used a system, and I certainly did not come up with the way that we did this. This is a method that was used in several other studies from the University of Washington and the University of Colorado. But it's a vignette system where you present two vignettes to a participant. One describes a generic behavioral intervention, one describes a genetic study, very general. And then you ask, well, how willing are you to participate in this? And they measure on a Likert scale. And after that, we then asked a bunch of what ifs and changed the facts a little bit. So what if it was conducted by a university? What if it was conducted by the Indian Health Service? What if it was conducted by the federal government, not the Indian Health Service? What if community members were involved? What if the study was approved by the tribe, community members involved in collection, interpretation? What if the focus of the study was on diabetes? And then, for our purposes, we also asked them a little bit about, well, how should the tribal system be structured to review and regulate research? And so what we found, and the background doesn't work really great on this slide, but what we found was that, this was our participation. We tended to have more women than men. And we ended up getting about 15% of all the enrolled adult members of the tribe to participate. And what we found is there was no statistical difference between willingness to participate in genetics research versus a generic behavioral intervention. And this was post-Havasupai, because some of the other studies that had applied this had been pre-Havasupai. And so one of our hypotheses was that this is going to affect, in some way, willingness to participate in research. And we didn't really find it. So 47%, 48% said, just off those vignettes, yes, I'd be willing to participate. So we'll run through some of the others. We see a higher willingness by women than men, 56% of women versus 29% of men. What's interesting is that the men, it wasn't so much that they said no, is that they said they weren't sure. So that's another thing that was interesting, is that they didn't come out and say no if they didn't say yes. They were more likely to say that they weren't sure. And what we saw was, if it was a personal salience, it went much higher, 73% for women and 52% for men. The other thing that we found is that we had three age categories, sort of 18 to 39, 40 to 54, and then 55 plus, as 55 being what Squaxin defines as an elder. And we see a very high progression towards yes as people got older, with 67% of elders saying yes. We saw a small drop if it was conducted by the university. It was pretty much a wash, a little bit lower in genetics if it was conducted by Indian Health Service. But I think you've heard this over and over again when we said, well, what if it's conducted by the federal government? And now they swap. 51% say no on the behavioral study and 48% say no on the genetics. And that's really not a statistical difference. But we saw a complete mirror swap of willingness pretty much. And we can talk about all those reasons why that exists. We saw increased with student community involvement, and again, a very high increase if it involves something of personal salience such as diabetes. So one of the things that was interesting about this was really going into and discussing the way that the tribe should regulate the research, because I think that that's where we have a lot of these ethical issues, is in the review by the tribe. And does the tribe have a robust system for reviewing research, which could lead to them, well, certainly I think will lead to them involving themselves in more research projects? Or does the tribe have nothing, in which case they're probably going to be less inclined to be involved? But they had a lot of discussions about, well, what's the best way to do it? And we saw, a lot of the same, pretty much a lot of the same issues that they have in other research willingness studies. They're concerned about confidentiality, was one of the big ones, especially in a tribal community. It's one thing if you're in the city of Seattle and you participate in a research project. Again, in my tribe, there's 1,200 members. That's not a big group of people. And depending on what the research study involves, if it's something that's stigmatizing, they have significant concerns about whether or not that is going to come back and paint them. The other thing they're concerned about is the political ramifications of it, which is something that really most people outside of Indian country don't think as much about. But within Indian country, the politics are ever present and in everything we do. We have, Squaxin Island, for instance, is a small, federally recognized sovereign tribe. We vote every year on electing our tribal council members. There are family blocks that negotiate with other families to try to generate support. There's blocks that will band together to try to throw somebody out. And if you're trying to throw somebody out, you're going to use whatever you can to throw them out. And if you don't think that they're going to use something that got out in a research study to throw somebody off the tribal council, you're crazy. We will use anything sometimes to try to remove someone from tribal council. And so people were very concerned about that. And we see that in this graph where they said only 9% of the people said that they were comfortable with a research system being directly under the tribal council and the executive director. They actually had strong ideas. Some said, well, we want it within the museum, library, and research center because that's a nonprofit organized under tribal law, but sits off to the side and not directly under the tribal council. Other people said they weren't even comfortable with that. We want a new system, a new nonprofit. And they liked the nonprofit. 17% didn't have an opinion. 13% didn't answer, just refused to answer. We didn't ask them why they didn't answer. And 13% not answered was actually a much higher number of not answering than anything else we saw. And so some people were even uncomfortable voting on where they thought a research system should be put in place. So it's important for researchers who are coming into these communities to understand that there are a lot of things at play. That even me, as I grew up in my community, I feel comfortable that I know the ebb and the flow, the politics and the priorities of my community. But I don't believe that I can go next door to the tribe that's only 15-minute drive away and tell you what the ebb and flow is there and what the priorities are there, and I'm sure they're going to be different, which is why you can't take the results for Squaxin Island and extrapolate them over all of Indian country. I think it would be much, much different if you did the same thing, for instance, at Navajo. And so it's such a complex system, and we've heard a lot of that today. We heard from Dr. Henderson that there's potential for an actual benefit to Native Americans from genetic research. We know that from various surveys that I did, that Abigail did, that other groups have done, that Native Americans, unlike that statement that Native Americans are not going to be involved in genetic research, that blanket statement is not true. It's just not true. Some aren't, some are, and some aren't sure. And with education, we learn that their willingness increases. But we also know that there's a lot of past history that influences that decision. And some of it is, and I'm not going to get into it, but some of it is very dark history for American Indians. And it's a history that we know and we're told growing up. And it's a part of the decisions that we make. We know that there's spiritual issues that we have to deal with. and that we don't, and somebody was talking about, this issue of participating in ancestry testing, why we have that big blank spot in the United States. It's because we won't participate in that for the most part, because it's asking us to speak for our tribe. It's asking us to give our blood so that we become reference points so that people can learn what their ancestry is. I individually may be fine with that, but what that's asking me to do is to do that on behalf of my entire community, because they need to know that I'm an Indian and they need to know what region I'm from. And if I may be comfortable, I know that many members of my family aren't. And what's the upside? And that's something that these communities have to think about and are constantly thinking about. What is the upside to genetic research? And you hear that over and over again. What is the upside to genetic research? And we're starting to see some upsides. But it's not a blanket upside. Not every type of genetic research has shown itself to be of value to Native Americans. And if you go to a community and you say, we want you to participate in this research project, and the community says, well, okay, we aren't funded to have a research system, so what you're asking us to do is to create one from our own funds. Or you're asking us to take people's FTE and apply it towards research review. And for a lot of tribes, that's difficult when the money that they have is going toward the increasing heroin use that we're seeing amongst many of our communities. And we've got wait times on beds to get people into treatment. Or our contract care money runs out before the end of the year. And if we want to treat somebody for cancer at the time they're diagnosed for cancer, then we're going to have to take money out of the tribal treasury and put it in to supplement the Indian Health Service. Or we have a clinic and we can only run at 60% staffing for our health care professionals because we just can't talk enough doctors to come and live, say, in northeast Montana at the Fort Peck Indian Reservation, who constantly runs at a 60 to 70% staffing load because of that. So when we ask these tribes to dedicate their time and their money towards something, they come back and they're gonna always say, what's the upside today to benefit our communities? But that doesn't mean that they don't want to participate. And that doesn't mean that if funded to do it, they won't. But one of the problems that we have is that the funding for research is for research projects. It's not funding for research systems. So if you want tribal participation in research, if you want these communities to participate, then we have to fund the infrastructure to allow them to participate and to partner. It's not community-based participatory research if that side of it, if one side of it is funded to the tune of $1 billion, like the University of Washington, to do research, and the partners is funded nothing. And as long as that disparity exists, we're always going to lag behind in research on health issues that are desperately needed to be researched. Thank you.